I always believed that trust, once broken, could never be restored. Yet, for most of my marriage, I never thought I'd have to test that belief. My wife, Melissa, had always been the picture of devotion, at least, that's what I let myself think. We met in college, built our lives together from the ground up. While I was grinding away at my construction business, she was climbing the corporate ladder in event planning. Over the years, I worked hard, invested wisely, and turned my small contracting company into a multi-million-dollar enterprise. We bought our dream home, traveled the world, and to anyone on the outside, we were the perfect couple. But all it takes is one moment, one single moment, to shatter everything. It started like this. A Tuesday morning, nothing special. I was sipping coffee, scrolling through the news on my phone when an article caught my attention. City's largest foam party hosted by tech tycoon Alexander Vaughn, a night of excess and extravagance. I almost skimmed past it, but then, something caught my eye. A photo. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light, maybe my mind playing games. But no. There she was. Melissa. In a white bikini, covered in foam, pressed up against Alexander Vaughn, the same billionaire known for hosting outrageous parties where the city's elite let loose in ways they'd never admit in daylight. She wasn't just in the background. No, she was front and center, her body practically melting into his. I felt my stomach turn to stone. She had told me she was at a business retreat. A weekend trip with her company. She even kissed me goodbye, told me not to stay up late, that she'd call me before bed. And she did. She even FaceTimed me from a hotel room. But now I knew, she had lied. My hands shook as I stared at the screen. I wanted to believe there was an explanation, that it wasn't what it looked like. But deep down, I knew better. I needed answers. I drove straight to the sheriff's office. If there was anything illegal happening at those parties, they'd know. Maybe this could expose Vaughn for the fraud he was. But when I got there, the response was cold. Mr. Vaughn is a respected businessman, the deputy said, barely looking up from his paperwork. I clenched my jaw. Respected businessman? He's hosting parties where married women throw themselves at him. What kind of business is that? The deputy exhaled. Listen, buddy, you're not the first guy to come in here ranting about some foam party. These women go there willingly. Your wife made her own choices. And Vaughn. The man has friends in high places. No one's touching him. No one's touching him. That was when I realized, I was on my own. Melissa hadn't said a word about the party when she got home. She acted like nothing happened. Smiled at me, kissed me, made dinner, told me about a boring conference. She had lied straight to my face. I didn't confront her. Not yet. Instead, I watched. Listened. Observed. And then I noticed something else. She was changing. At first, it was subtle. A distant look in her eyes. A softer tone in her voice when she said she was going out with the girls. But then, 2 months later, her body started changing too. Her belly. I didn't say a word. I just waited. Because if my suspicions were correct, then Melissa had made the worst mistake of her life. And I was going to make sure she paid for it. After that morning at the sheriff's office, something inside me shifted. I knew I couldn't rely on the law to fix this. No one wanted to cross Alexander Vaughn, the tech billionaire who ran this city like his personal playground. But I wasn't just going to sit back and let him get away with it. And Melissa, my wife, the woman who had sworn to love me, had made her choice too. She just didn't know that I had already started making mine. For the next few weeks, I acted normal. Played the part of the devoted husband, smiled when she smiled, laughed when she laughed. But all the while, I watched her closely. The first real crack in her facade came one evening when she sat across from me at dinner. I noticed how she pushed her food around her plate without eating much. "You okay?" I asked, feigning concern. She hesitated, then forced a smile. "Yeah, just feeling a little off lately. Probably something I ate." I nodded, but inside, I was already connecting the dots. A week later, she started wearing looser clothes. Another week after that, she started avoiding intimacy. And then, the moment of confirmation came. I had placed a small GPS tracker on her car, not because I needed to know where she was at all times, but because I wanted proof. If she was lying to me about the party, what else was she lying about? One evening, she said she was meeting some friends for dinner. I watched as she left the house, got in her car, and drove off. But instead of heading toward the restaurant she mentioned, she drove across town to a private clinic. A pregnancy clinic. I clenched my fists so hard my knuckles turned white. It wasn't mine. It couldn't be. Melissa had always been meticulous with birth control. We had talked about having kids before, but she always said, "Not yet. Let's wait until we're ready." Yet here she was. Pregnant. And I already knew who the father was. I didn't confront her right away. Instead, I dug deeper. That night, while she was sleeping, I unlocked her phone. She wasn't careful, same password she had used for years. I scrolled through her messages, my heart pounding in my chest. Then I found them. Messages from an unsaved number. Him. "Vaughn, you sure about this?" "Melissa, yes. I took the test today. It's yours." "Vaughn, I told you I'm not getting involved." "Melissa, I wasn't asking you to. I just thought you should know." "Vaughn, handle it." I stared at the screen, my blood running cold. Handle it? Vaughn had used her. Tossed her aside the second she became an inconvenience. And now, she was stuck with the consequences. She hadn't told me yet. She was probably waiting, trying to figure out how to spin the lie. Maybe she'd say it was an accident, that it was mine, that she wanted to surprise me. But I wasn't going to give her the chance. No. I was going to play the long game. Over the next few days, I started putting my plan into motion. I pretended to be supportive, played the loving husband role. "Babe, you've been looking tired lately," I said one evening. "Everything okay?" She hesitated, then nodded. "Yeah, just work stress." Lies. I reached across the table and held her hand, looking into her eyes. "Maybe we should take a weekend trip. Just us. Get away for a bit." She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "That sounds nice." I knew she was stalling. I knew she was scared. But she had no idea just how much I already knew. And soon, she'd realized that she wasn't the only one who could keep secrets. Patience. That's what it took. I wanted to rip the truth out of her, to throw those text messages in her face and watch her crumble under the weight of her own lies. But that wasn't enough. No, I wanted her to suffer like I had. So, I waited. She still hadn't told me about the pregnancy, which meant she was still trying to figure out how to handle it. Maybe she was hoping Vaughn would step up. Maybe she thought I'd be clueless enough to believe it was mine. Either way, she was running out of time. One evening, she came home later than usual. I was sitting on the couch, pretending to be half asleep watching TV. I heard her slip off her heels at the door, her quiet footsteps as she walked toward the stairs. "Hey," I called out, making her jump. She turned, clutching her purse. "Hey. I didn't want to wake you." I glanced at the time on my phone. "It's almost midnight. Thought you were just getting dinner with the girls." She hesitated for only a second, but I caught it. "Yeah, we lost track of time." Lies. "Everything okay?" I asked, standing up and walking toward her. "You've seemed different lately?" She forced a smile, shaking her head. "I'm fine. Just a lot on my mind." I reached out, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear. I saw her tense. "You know you can talk to me, right?" I said, my voice calm, steady. For a moment, I thought she might actually tell me. She opened her mouth, then closed it again. Instead, she nodded. "Of course, baby. I love you." She kissed me, soft and careful. Like she was afraid I'd see through her if she lingered too long. I kissed her back, but in my head, I was already moving on to the next phase of my plan. Step 1, make her feel safe. Over the next week, I became the perfect husband. Breakfast in bed. Surprise flowers. Small gifts. Melissa started to let her guard down, even though I could tell she was still holding something back. She didn't realize that every nice thing I did wasn't out of love. It was a rope. And she was walking right into the noose. Step 2, find the cracks. I needed to know if Vaughn still had any contact with her. If he still cared at all, or if she was just another disposable toy to him. So I did something I never thought I'd do. I reached out to him. I had a business connection who had done contracting work for Vaughn's estate. Through him, I set up a casual meeting under the pretense of discussing potential renovations on one of his properties. Vaughn, always looking for ways to expand his empire, agreed. We met at an upscale bar downtown. He walked in like he owned the place, designer suit, gold watch, that arrogant smirk that made my blood boil. We shook hands, sat down. I played my part. Talked business for a few minutes before steering the conversation elsewhere. "So, I hear you throw some pretty wild parties," I said, taking a sip of my drink. Vaughn chuckled. "You could say that. You been to one?" I smiled. "Not personally. But I think someone I know has." His smirk barely faltered, but I caught the flicker of recognition in his eyes. "Yeah," he said, leaning back in his chair. "Who?" I took my time. Let the silence stretch between us. "My wife," I finally said. For the first time, Vaughn looked slightly uncomfortable. But only for a second. He shrugged, swirling his drink. "Lot of women come to those parties," he said. "Hard to keep track." He was lying. I knew he remembered her. But I wanted to see how far he'd take it. I leaned forward. "She's pregnant." That made him pause. Just for a second. But I caught it. I kept my voice even, my expression unreadable. "You wouldn't happen to know anything about that, would you?" Vaughn exhaled, setting his glass down. "Look, man, whatever she told you, that's between you two. I don't get involved in this kind of drama. So you admit you slept with her?" He ran a hand through his hair, exasperated. She knew what it was. I didn't force her. She wanted it as much as I did. My fingers tightened around my glass. I wanted to slam it into his smug face. But I couldn't blow my cover. I forced a chuckle. "Yeah, well, now she's carrying your kid." Vaughn scoffed. "Not my problem." And just like that, I knew exactly what kind of man he was. He used her, tossed her aside, and didn't even care about the fallout. I smiled. "Fair enough." We finished our drinks. I made small talk. And then I left. I walked out of that bar knowing one thing for sure, both of them were going to pay. Melissa for betraying me. And Vaughn for thinking he could get away with it. The moment I walked out of that bar, I knew exactly what I had to do. Melissa thought she was in control, carefully weaving her lies. Vaughn thought he was untouchable, just another billionaire who could do whatever he wanted. They were both wrong. That night, I walked into our bedroom, watching her as she brushed her hair in the mirror. She looked up and smiled. "You're in a good mood," she said. I smiled back. Just thinking about our future. She turned, placing a hand on her belly, subconsciously, almost protective. Yeah. I nodded. Yeah. She had no idea what was coming. The next morning, I started planting the seeds. I reached out to a few reporters, ones I knew weren't afraid to take down the rich and powerful. I fed them just enough, anonymous tips about Vaughn's exclusive parties, and his habit of discarding women like used napkins. I wasn't after just revenge. I wanted ruin. Melissa, still oblivious, finally sat me down that evening. There's something I need to tell you, she started, her voice shaky. I raised an eyebrow, pretending I didn't know. What is it? She hesitated, tears forming. I'm pregnant. I let the silence stretch, watching her squirm. Then I smiled. That's great news, babe. Her breath caught. She hadn't expected that. She had no idea I was already 10 steps ahead. Melissa stared at me, searching my face for any hint of suspicion. She had expected anger, maybe even accusations. But I gave her none of that. Instead, I reached across the table, took her hand, and smiled. We're going to be parents. Her lips parted slightly, like she couldn't believe what she was hearing. You're happy? I nodded. Of course. Why wouldn't I be? I watched as relief flooded her face. She had no idea she had just stepped into my trap. The next morning, the first article dropped. Billionaire tech mogul's private parties, more than just business. It didn't mention Melissa, yet. But Vaughn's name was all over it. The press was sniffing around, and soon, every scandal he had tried to bury would start rising to the surface. Melissa read the article over breakfast, her fingers gripping the phone tightly. Did you see this? She asked. I took a sip of my coffee, feigning confusion. No, what is it? She hesitated. It's about Vaughn. I leaned over, scanning the headline. Wow. Guess not all rich guys are untouchable, huh? She swallowed hard, nodding. She didn't know whether to panic or pretend it had nothing to do with her. Either way, the walls were closing in. Melissa barely ate that morning. She kept glancing at her phone, scrolling through the article again and again. Vaughn hadn't called. No damage control, no reassurances. She was on her own, and she knew it. Good. I acted normal, kissed her goodbye, told her to take it easy, even reminded her to drink more water. She nodded absent-mindedly, distracted, her mind racing. She didn't suspect a thing. At work, I made my next move. I had a friend in private security, someone who specialized in making problems very public. I sent him a simple message. Find everything you can on Vaughn. And make sure the right people see it. By lunchtime, the second article was live. Secret guest list leaked, high-profile figures tied to Vaughn's infamous foam parties. Names. Photos. Hints of NDAs that couldn't legally hold up in court. Vaughn was in trouble, and it was only going to get worse. That evening, Melissa came home looking pale. Long day? I asked, setting down my beer. She hesitated. Yeah. I watched her closely as she sat across from me, biting her lip. She wanted to talk. She was dying to talk. But she was still calculating, still weighing her options. I leaned forward. Something on your mind? She looked up, startled. Huh? I smiled. You seem off. You sure everything's okay? She forced a weak laugh. Just tired. Lies. She wasn't ready to confess yet. But I could feel it coming. That night, while she showered, I checked her phone again. She had deleted the messages from Vaughn, but I knew better. I pulled up her call logs. She had tried calling him. 3 times. No answer. I smirked. She was panicking. And I was loving every second of it. Melissa wasn't sleeping well. I could hear her tossing and turning, sighing in frustration. Every so often, I felt her shift beside me, probably glancing at her phone to see if Vaughn had finally called. But he hadn't. He never would. The once untouchable billionaire was too busy watching his empire burn. More reports were coming out, women stepping forward, anonymous sources confirming what everyone already suspected. Vaughn wasn't just hosting wild parties. He was buying loyalty, making problems disappear, ensuring the women who left his mansion never spoke a word. But now, the whole city was talking. And Melissa was drowning in fear. The next morning, she barely looked at me as she made coffee. Her hands were shaking as she poured her cup. "You okay?" I asked, my voice laced with concern. She flinched. "Yeah. Just, stressed." I walked up behind her, placing my hands on her shoulders, feeling the tension there. "Anything I can do to help?" She hesitated, then shook her head. "No. I'll figure it out." I wanted to laugh. She was still trying to handle this, to control the damage. But there was no fixing this. Not for her. Not for Vaughn. Not for either of them. That afternoon, I got a call from my contact. "Vaughn's lawyers are scrambling. He's going dark." I smiled. "And Melissa?" She tried calling him again this morning. Still no answer. Perfect. It was only a matter of time before she broke. Sure enough, that night, she cracked. We were sitting on the couch, watching TV. Or at least, I was watching. Melissa was staring at her lap, lost in thought. Finally, she turned to me. "There's something I need to tell you," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I muted the TV and gave her my full attention. "Yeah." She swallowed hard. She stopped, squeezing her eyes shut. Her hands were clenched into fists, her entire body tense. This was it. The moment she would finally admit her betrayal. I leaned forward, waiting. And then, her phone rang. She jumped, scrambling to grab it. I watched as her face fell. Unknown number. She hesitated, then answered. "Hello." A pause. Then, her eyes went wide. She shot up from the couch, walking toward the kitchen. I followed quietly, staying just out of sight. "Wait, what?" she whispered. "What do you mean he's?" She froze. I could hear her breath hitch. Her entire body stiffened. Then, in a barely audible voice. "Oh my God." She pulled the phone away from her ear, staring at the screen like it had just delivered a death sentence. I stepped forward. "Melissa? What's wrong?" She turned to me, her face pale. "Vaughn," she breathed. I raised an eyebrow. "What about him?" She swallowed, struggling to get the words out. "He's gone." I stared at her. "Gone?" She nodded slowly. He left the country." I let that sink in for a moment. Then, I leaned back against the counter and exhaled. "Well," I said, grabbing a beer from the fridge. "Guess that means you're all alone now." Her breath hitched. She looked at me like she had just realized something. Something terrifying. Something she should have known from the beginning. I wasn't as clueless as she thought. And now, she had nowhere to run. Melissa stood frozen, her phone still clutched in her trembling hand. "Gone." I repeated, my voice calm, measured. She nodded. He fled. His lawyers can't reach him. No one can." I took a slow sip of my beer, letting the silence stretch. "Guess he didn't care as much as you thought." Her lip quivered. I never. I raised a hand. Don't. She snapped her mouth shut, her eyes darting around the room like she was trying to find a way out. But there was none. Not anymore. I stepped closer. Tell me, Melissa. What was your plan? Lie to me? Make me raise another man's kid? Tears welled up in her eyes. I was going to tell you, she whispered. When? My voice was sharp now. Before or after the baby was born? She looked down, ashamed. That was all the confirmation I needed. I scoffed, shaking my head. You thought I wouldn't find out. I didn't want to hurt you, she choked out. I laughed, an actual laugh, cold and bitter. You didn't want to hurt me. Melissa, you destroyed everything. And for what? A rich man who abandoned you the second things got complicated. She wiped at her tears. I made a mistake. I stared at her, my jaw clenched. Yeah. You did. And now, she was going to pay for it. I let her sit with her guilt for a few days. I barely spoke to her, barely acknowledged her. She was spiraling, trying to fix something that couldn't be fixed. Then, one evening, I walked into the kitchen and placed an envelope on the counter. She looked at it, then up at me. What's this? Divorce papers. Her breath caught. No, please. I held up a hand. Save it. I've already made my decision. Tears streamed down her face. I don't want to lose you. I leaned in, my voice barely above a whisper. You lost me the moment you stepped into that foam party. She sobbed, gripping the counter like it was the only thing keeping her upright. But I wasn't done yet. You'll also notice a clause, I continued. I'm keeping the house. And you? You get nothing. She gasped. You can't do that. I smirked. I can. And I did. Her lips trembled. But the baby. I stepped back. That's not my problem. And with that, I walked away. Melissa stared at the divorce papers, her hands shaking so badly that the pages crinkled. You don't mean this, she whispered, desperation creeping into her voice. We can fix this. I leaned against the counter, arms crossed. Fix what, exactly? She wiped at her face. Us. I let out a bitter chuckle. There is no us anymore, Melissa. She shook her head violently. I was scared. I didn't know what to do. Vaughn, he promised me things, and then he just, her voice cracked. He left me. I nodded. And now you want me to pick up the pieces. She sniffled. I still love you. I stared at her for a long moment. Then, I spoke. No, you don't. You love the life I gave you. The security. The comfort. But you threw me away the second you saw something shinier. She flinched like I had slapped her. Good. I stepped forward, my voice cold. I've already filed. The house stays mine, the assets stay mine, and once the paternity test confirms what we both already know, you'll be walking away with nothing. Her lips parted, but no words came out. She finally understood. She had gambled, and lost. The next morning, I made sure she was gone. I had her things packed up and waiting in the driveway before she even woke up. When she came downstairs, her face paled. You're serious? I gestured to the bags. There's the proof. Tears welled in her eyes. Where am I supposed to go? I shrugged. Not my problem. She just stood there, shoulders shaking, reality sinking in. Vaughn had left her. I had destroyed her. And now, she had nothing. As she drove away, I felt nothing but satisfaction. This wasn't just about revenge. This was about making sure she never forgot what she had done. And she wouldn't. Because while she had lost everything, I was finally free. Melissa's car disappeared down the street, leaving nothing but the faint hum of an engine fading into the distance. I stood on the porch, watching, waiting. I expected to feel something. Sadness. Regret. Maybe even second thoughts. But all I felt was relief. For the first time in months, the weight pressing down on my chest was gone. The lies, the betrayal, the constant knots in my stomach, all of it vanished the second she left my life. She had made her choice. And I had made mine. I walked inside and poured myself a drink, sinking into the couch. My phone buzzed with a notification. Breaking: billionaire Alexander Vaughn under federal investigation for fraud and tax evasion. I smirked. It seemed I wasn't the only one making sure he paid for his mistakes. Melissa had thrown everything away for a man who never cared about her, and now, he wouldn't even be around to save himself. Poetic justice. A week later, the paternity results arrived. 0% probability of paternity. No shock there. Melissa tried calling. Once. Twice. 5 times. I never answered. Eventually, she stopped trying. People always say revenge is hollow, that it doesn't fix anything. Maybe they're right. But as I stood in my home, with no more lies poisoning the air, I knew one thing for sure. I had won. And now, I was finally free to start over.